Hi, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome. I often talk about, in this perspective that I'm sharing and inviting folks to explore, I talk about different doorways into it. And one that I frequently mention is seeing what it is that all of this apparent differentiation and distinction and diversity that we experience in everything. Um, what is it? What does it all have in common? Does it have something in common? And um, so if you look at what we have to look at, which is experience from one moment to the next, and within any given instant, if you will, we seem to be experiencing this incredible diversity of phenomena, right? Memories, feelings, sensations, all these different names that we give this different phenomena that are occurring. Um, I want you to notice, invite you to notice right now that no matter what you do or don't do, no matter where attention may go, either through some sense of intentionally moving it somewhere or just suddenly attention just goes wherever it goes, um, that one thing that is undeniable and inarguable is that it's impossible to get out of experience. Try right now. See if it's possible to ever leave what we could call experiencing. I mean, it's a word. What does it point to? I'll leave that up to you. But this is a sense of experience. You could say the sense of something happening, right? That we could call experiencing. Experience is a great word. I don't know why I find it evocative and simple and not laden with a lot of ideas about it per se. But this is actually an extraordinary thing that you can't ever escape experience. Your experience, the content of experience, the description of experience, the flavor of experience is never the same, always different, right? And as I often talk about, experience also has this quality, this feature of transiency, of ever-changing impermanence, right? So it's just constantly on the move, isn't it? It's not really static. It's not holding still. So really, experientially speaking, there's just this constant discontinuity, this constant falling away of what's here. But what is constant is that even though, and this is very paradoxical, even though everything is falling away, slipping away, vanishing, owing to the dynamic nature of what's here, there is this constancy, and the constancy is, we could say, the flow of experiencing itself. You just feel the way that is true, the way that is the case. It's like there's this universe, and consciousness in a sense, wanders around the universe of experience, encountering all the different things it encounters moment by moment. And yet there's no exiting the universe of experience. There's no exit. So, we're looking as humans for something stable, for something that we can hold on to, and often that will be like a nice feeling or an insight or realization or sense of well-being. Like, and then it feels like, the things that we're looking for, it feels like we'll find them in certain moments and then they will slip away, right? Well, I had that wonderful sense of open-heartedness and open-mindedness and clarity and ease and, right, flow. And then I don't know, it went away. And next thing I knew, I felt contracted and stuck and like I lost touch with it. And we have this sense of like, just in normal human terms, when that happens, then we essentially go on a search to try to gather experiences and circumstances that will bring back whatever it is we feel we've lost, right? So we're on this kind of hamster wheel, if you will, of searching for whatever it is we're looking for. Now, as I was saying before, the only thing we can ever find is experience, right? So no matter what we're looking for, either as just ordinary humans looking for what the things that humans are looking for in their circumstances and in their lives, or if we put it in more of a spiritual context, the things that spiritual seekers are searching for, all you're ever going to find is experience. There's nothing else that can be found. And yes, we can do find some experiences that we find preferable or that we associate with whatever it is we imagine we're missing or lacking. But what is common about all these different phenomena that are encountered, some which we associate with what we want, what we're aspiring to realize, and some which we think are representative or proof of having lost something and we're missing something or lacking something. In either of those cases, I've got it or I've lost it, and now I need to find it again. What's common about those? What's common about them is that they're experience. Experience is the common denominator. Experiencing, we could say, because of its dynamic nature. Experiences suggest something holding still, something static, but experiencing is dynamic, it's alive, it's a verb, experiencing. And the experiencing feels like a flow, doesn't it? It's this sense of the flow is I think arises out of the dynamic nature of this. But just see that now that you can never be, it's impossible to lose experience. It's impossible to be cast out of experiencing. The ocean of experiencing is all that exists, even as it shows up as all these distinctive phenomenal waves of experience: pleasure, pain, sorrow, joy, clarity, confusion, openness, contraction, all these ways we might characterize the way in which the ocean of experiencing seems to form itself and pattern itself in all these distinctive ways. But what it is fundamentally is just experiencing, whatever that is. There's no real words for it. So we imagine the kind of conventional view of things, um, I would suggest both, just again, in ordinary human life and in spiritual circles, is that what we're looking for looks a particular way, like it looks like and feels a certain way. In other words, we associate it with particular kinds of experiences. Ah, yes. Now that's it. But what if what we're looking for is not found in the particularities of how experience seems to be showing up and being described and characterized, but in the flow of experiencing itself? What if that was the real, well, what was that was the real mother lode that we're looking for? Well, it is. But that's the invitation to discover that. It's in the flow of experiencing itself, the constancy of that, ever present, always here. What's here is not always here, is it? Gone just like that. This perception, gone just like that. But the perceiving itself never goes anywhere. It never goes away, even though it is constantly morphing. The perceiving itself, that flow of perceiving itself. This is what you are. This is what you are. And what you are can never be apart from, because it's always here. The flow of perceiving, the flow of experiencing. There isn't anything else. What else is there? The flow of perceiving. Here it is, right here. And then it turns into something else, and the Zoom call will eventually end, and the flow of perceiving continues, doesn't it? Doesn't end, has no end. Whatever we might call an end would be the next way the flow of perceiving is appearing. Feel the constancy of that, the constancy of perceiving. It's like a light that just you cannot turn off. There is no darkness. The light never goes out. What we call darkness is illuminated and described as the lack of illumination, i.e. darkness. But the darkness is illuminated. Illumination is the constant. This is illuminated, isn't it? Perfectly clear. This moment is perfectly clear, isn't it? Whatever it is, however you're describing it, perfectly clear, illuminated. Feel kind of tired and out of sorts, perfectly illuminated as just what is being revealed. Perfectly illuminated, effortlessly illuminated. The illumination is happening. The engine of illumination is turned on, isn't it? We know not how, but here it is, turned on. The world is lit up. The world of experiencing is illuminated. Try to turn it off. Can't be done. Pleasure, illuminated. Pain, illuminated. Heartbreak, illuminated. Ecstasy, illuminated. People coming together in harmony and understanding, illuminated. People in conflict and disagreement, illuminated. The illumination, that's the constant. That's what can be counted on. That's the ground the groundless ground that never goes anywhere, and which can't be lost. How can you lose this? When are you ever apart from this? There you're having this moment. I feel I've lost this. I'm apart from this. Where has it gone? I've lost God, perfectly illuminated. See, the illumination can't go anywhere. It can look like anything, does look like all this stuff showing up, the magic show of life. Nothing philosophical about this whatsoever, nothing metaphysical in the sense of abstract. It's concretely so, isn't it? The moment is lit. The illumination and what is being illuminated are one thing. They're not like two things. Phenomena are illumination. And the illumination shows up and displays itself as what we call phenomena. One thing. Just feel that. Feel that illumination, that illuminative. Feel that the power of perceiving itself, the power of knowing. And feel how it is here spontaneously. It is the light of that knowing, that light of that perceiving is not here because of something we're doing to make it here. It's not here because we're paying attention to it. It's here. And it's not something that we have, it is simply what is the very basis of everything, including what we think of as ourselves. You close your eyes, that's what's being illuminated. You open your eyes, this is what's being illuminated. It's luscious, isn't it? That all pervading light. Can never be lost. Remember, it can never be lost. It can never really be found either, because it just simply is. It's here before it's looked for. It's just here. It may sometimes feel as if it's very localized and somehow limited to the organism, to ourselves, to a body and a mind. But the notion of its limitation is an abstraction, actually, because if you investigate what's here experientially, what we think of as limited and localized and body bound, it can't be found. That limitation can't actually be found. If you look, you will see anything that you imagine to be limited is completely unlimited and infinite, and boundless and unfathomable. Maybe a good stopping point. Just see what's happening in your worlds that you might like to explore um, together. Do you have a sense of what I was pointing to there, what I was attempting to highlight, this constancy that never goes anywhere, even though it's always going away? It's very strange to say it that way, but um,
Are you saying there's a distinction between illumination and what is illuminated, or are they one and the same?
no, they're one and the same. Yeah.
So in that case, it's like what when you're talking, it made me
It's
think
like a
of.
light. It's like a light that's taking lots of different forms, just like a light that's flickering, right? And it's each flicker is a new form that it's taking, right?
Mhm.
But it's always remaining itself. It's always remaining the light, the illuminating light that's taking lots of different forms, but none of those forms ever are anything other than the movement of that illuminating light. So that's the paradox, is um, it's always looking different, but never leaving itself, never departing from itself. Just like, my um, well-worn, ocean wave metaphor, right? Like the waves are always looking different and distinct, but they never actually depart from what they're arising out of. They're made of what they're arising out of, right? So, and you can look in terms of like the perceiving function. We could call it awareness, and sometimes people do. But what's perceiving this moment, right? And whatever is being perceived, we describe perceptions as separate from the perceiving, right? I mean, there's the perceiver is separate from what's being perceived. But can you find any distinction? That's the invitation, to look and see if you can actually find.
So then, based on what you just said, what's interesting is then to try to find where that, just like the wave in the ocean,
Hmm.
interesting to see where, for example, if I'm really happy
Hmm.
and then all of a sudden that shifts into like feeling grumpy. So it's
Right.
like, where, it's like you can't find, or there's not like a box around, oh, I'm happy now.
Hmm.
And then I'm not describing it very well.
Hmm. Mhm.
You know what I'm saying? There's like it's fascinating to see the seamless
Right, right. Yeah,
shift of form.
it is, and you know what, um, one way to, I think, to sort of put it into a structure, even though it can't really be put into a structure, is to say that um, something, I use this metaphor sometimes of constellations in the night sky, right? And if you look up and you see the Big Dipper is one I often use, just because it's such an obvious patterning of, right? So it looks like a kind of a pattern, right? Which is how we gave it a name, the Big Dipper. Well, what is it actually a pattern of, a seeming pattern of? It's a pattern of lights, right? Call them stars, but we'll just say lights in the night sky. So that seem to kind of pattern themselves in a particular way. And what's really fascinating to do with any of those states that we seem to be kind of flowing in and out of, like joy and then fear, and the countless names we have for these different states, like what are they patterns of? There's something there, right, that makes those, like, a grumpy, what we call, I'm grumpy. What is that? What is it a pattern of, seemingly? You could say it's like, it can be useful to sort of reduce all the seeming patterns to something like energy. Okay, well, it's a way energy is configured or patterned, seemingly patterned, that looks and feels distinct from another patterning of energy, like joy or happiness. There's no answers to these questions, of course, so that, which is the whole point. But the real point is to explore all of our experiences and discover the ways in which um, the patterns can't the patterns don't hold up under scrutiny, because what you find when you look for the things that make up, like, whatever you're describing. I mean, take something as seemingly concrete and limited as the body, as an experience, not as a concept, but as an experience. Well, what is that as experience? Well, go and look. It looks like a pattern of experience, but what is that pattern? And you look and you look and you look and you look, and you discover that the seeming pattern doesn't have a clear structure to it, because there's too much information, there's too much detail. I mean, every single particle of the experience, if you will, if you think of it as particles of whatever information or energy, is infinitely detailed, right? And those details are infinitely detailed, and so you end up in this, like, well, where do you end up? You end up where you always are, which is swimming in infinity that doesn't have a clear pattern, even though it shows up as all this. It doesn't. This is the trippy thing, is that it, back in the old days, well, I guess it can still happen with TVs, where you would turn it on and you just didn't have a good signal, and it would just be like snow, right, on the screen showing up. Real, like, a randomness, no clear pattern, just complete. So what's strange is that even though with all of our experience, you can't find what looks to be clearly patterned, when you investigate it, doesn't hold up under scrutiny. For one thing, we've talked a lot about this on these calls, that whatever is there is constantly changing. So if you really investigate it with a certain kind of sensitivity and precision, you can see that the patterns, they're unpatterned, because whatever was there as a seeming pattern has no duration. So where's the pattern, right? So it's unpatterned, and yet in human life, it doesn't look like snow. It looks patterned. It looks structured. It looks elegantly structured, unfathomably beautifully aesthetically structured. every aspect of it. And it's just incredible structures. Look at the natural world and the body and well, everything. I mean, it's just incredible, you know. So it's very strange. It's like you can't find the structure is not ultimately structured when you look for it because it's infinite. It's not clearly patterned, and yet it shows up as distinctive patterns, which is what a lot of our descriptions suggest, right? The descriptions, hey, that's sadness. That's the pattern. I recognize it. It seems to have a kind of constancy to it from moment to moment, which is how I can describe it. So, right? If we didn't experience it that way, then it wouldn't feel structured at all. It wouldn't feel coherent at all. It would feel like snow. It would feel like complete abstract, like a abstract painting with no structure to it. And at one level, it is like that. It is like an abstract painting with no structure to it. And yet that shows up as the most incredible structure and form, doesn't it?
And then would you say that investigation and exploration themselves are patterns as well?
Absolutely. Yeah. Everything that we could possibly describe seemingly as a phenomena and give a name to. Yeah, the whole thing, everything, mind, body, the world, people, nature, there's dictionaries. How many words are in the English dictionary? There's a lot. Um, and yes, all of that arises out of reality seems to pattern itself, show up as patterns, as forms. But again, we talked about this, I think, last week about the old Buddhist, emptiness is form and form is emptiness. That again is that the forms that show up as a form, like that are recognizable, like um, faces, for example, which seems in human encounters to be very important. Facial recognition, and like I've seen you before, and you're recognizable as it's a pattern, isn't it? I've seen the pattern before, or so it seems, because I've never actually seen the pattern before. Not like this, and not like this, and not like this, because, right, you're changing. It's very obvious to see, like, the form of the body, let's say. And if you look at a picture of yourself 10 years ago or a picture of 20, 30 years ago, right? What's really obvious that the form has been changing, correct? So did it just suddenly take a big giant leap? No, it's kind of an incremental change from moment to moment, isn't it? That can really be seen obviously when you look, say at photographs or something. But actually, it's changing every instant, isn't it? But it looks, but if we were seeing, like, if every time I looked at you I couldn't see any coherent pattern because I wasn't using the reference point of memory, right? Then it would just be like I'd never encountered this before. It's like completely, I've never seen this before. I don't know what this is. And in a sense, I don't. I literally don't. And it's really fun to feel the reality of that. Like, feel right now, like imagine right now for a moment, because there's truth to this imagination, which is that there's no context for this moment. There's no prior reference point to know what this moment is, because this moment is, how do you know you've ever experienced this moment before? Well, all you know is this moment, right? I mean, it's really, really odd, but the only context of knowledge, in a sense, is something that we call the past, isn't it? But feel what's here right now, just now, with no past. What is this? Just be with it, just now, no past. It's pure mystery, isn't it? In a sense, with no knowledge of what it is, but just the freshness of just now.
I was in a sensory deprivation tank about a year ago, and it totally freaked me out. And I think it's partly what you just said. There was no past. So I had never experienced not hearing, not seeing, not feeling, not touching, just total darkness. And it just scared the hell out of me because I had never, it was like I'd never experienced that before. And when you said it's, right now we put labels on it, or we have a past, and I didn't have a past to that.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it's like losing your reference points. But what I was just illustrating to you was like, in a way, you're always in the sensory deprivation tank. In the sense of, yeah, we can go back, consciousness can go back and pull back the reference points, which it does all the time, right? Which is how there's this sense of, it seems, one way to explain how there is this sense of a kind of continuity. Like, I've known you before, there's a continuity there. But in another very real way, there is not. There's just the actuality of this. I call it the freshness, of every moment. It's not, um, it's free of what was. I mean, because where is what was? I mean, isn't that wild? Like, if we even say there is such a thing as a prior to this moment, right? Something that came before it. So we'll go into abstraction for a moment and say there's a thing called a past and a history, blah, 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 that whole narrative of your life or my life or any of our lives. Where is it now? You can remember your childhood or your adolescence or your young adulthood, and the different encounters you've had and people you've known. And where is all of that happening? Here. The only time anything is ever happening, actually happening. This is what's alive. This. And when you're describing your experience in the sensory deprivation tank, and we were talking in that little guided inquiry at the outset about this illuminating perceiving, right, that never goes anywhere. That illuminating function of perceiving was right there in the middle of that sensory deprivation experience, wasn't it? Illuminating that moment. It didn't go anywhere. All the senses kind of got very shut down, almost like deep sleep, like very, you're quieting all the normal sensory kind of input and stimulation. But the perceiving was right there, wasn't it?
Yeah, the aliveness there was no doubt that, I was alive. I mean, it was just
Right.
illuminated, the
Exactly.
aliveness.
Exactly. Yeah.
But you also recognize the fear, the
Oh, yeah.
pattern of fear
Exactly. That
that
was
was
there
there
too.
also.
Exactly. I mean, anything could be there. You could have been in a state of ecstasy. I mean, maybe the next time you do it, it'll be ecstatic rather than a little terrifying. Who knows? It could be
And then
anything.
the fear form shifted into a full-blown panic attack where I
Mm.
had to bolt and get out of there
Uh-huh.
because
Uh-huh.
I totally freaked out.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. From what I was sharing earlier about that, the constancy of experiencing itself, right? Experience is always changing, but the experiencing is this constant, right? So in the normal human, from the normal human paradigm, is it really matters what's happening. It really matters what my circumstances are. It really matters what my experiences are. Why? Because I tend to equate my well-being, my satisfaction, my spiritual realization, blah, 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 with certain circumstances and experiences. But from the perspective that I'm talking about, that it doesn't matter what your experience is, literally. It completely does not matter. It doesn't mean that you don't have preferences, because you probably will till your last breath. Um, but experiencing, in other words, we're looking for this sense of fulfillment, and right, I mean, we're looking to feel like we're at home, or these human aspirations to feel fulfilled, to feel whole, to feel complete, to feel well. It's just universal, right? And what I'm talking about is that those things are the very nature of the experiencing itself, the very nature of presence itself, the presence of this. Its very nature is whole and full and complete. And it doesn't depend upon how experience is looking. Experiences come and go. They come and go, don't they? But the flow of experiencing doesn't come and go. And that's what I mean, that your experience doesn't matter.
So when you say we're looking for a sense of wholeness, well-being, is that also a pattern?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, in a sense, taken to its radical core, that whole, there's no, the entire thing, the search can't be found either. Yeah. What we're searching is yet another indeterminate, unresolvable, ungraspable, patternless seeming pattern, right? That we're calling searching. So both the search and then the resolution of the search can't be found, neither of those. There's something here that might show up as what we're calling searching, or might show up as, oh, the search is over. It could look like anything again. But what's here is what's constant. And it's not describable ultimately, even though it seems to be describable. It seems to show up as describable patterns, right? For sure it does. I would never argue against that, because that's my experience, is it feels patterned. It feels like flavors that are distinct from other flavors. Very specific, very specific. Again, the paradox is you take the most specific thing, like, wow, that moment that I'm describing as specifically, like you described a very specific thing, like panic, right? A very specific flavor. What is panic? It's a pattern, seeming pattern of something that can't be found ultimately. Panic is fathomless infinity showing up in a particular way.
It seems the parts can be describable, but the whole can never be describable.
Right. The parts, they seem to be, and that's this idea of, it seems like I can draw a line around the part and identify it and put a limit around it, right? And there it is. But when we've explored this quite a bit on these calls, when we go to try to find the boundary of that part, can't find it. There's a continuum. And that's like a trick to notice that, because it starts to cut through this partialization and this defining, which is so habitual and so taken for granted to be, that's the one reality, is that, yes, this is made of pieces and parts. And yeah, from one perspective, it definitely is. But from this other perspective, you can't find any pieces or parts. I cannot find where the boundaries of what I call ed. I can't find them visually. I can't find them in any way, shape, or form. You're just you're inseparable from the whole. You are the whole.
You know, even conceptually, the actual experiences, you know, John and is John
Mm-hmm.
because he's not everything else.
Right.
So everything else is always there in the background to even define the parts.
Right. But it becomes really impossible to really, you take any person or any experience and you say, like, at what point do I get to the end? I have finally reached the boundary of John, or the boundary of panic. And now I get to the other side of that. It's like the wall. And on the other side of that is no panic. It's like, it's a continuum. There's not clear boundary lines around these things. I mean, they're not. Just look. Where are they? But we describe the world as if it's bounded and separate. And I mean, the visual field is a great example of that, where just look at the visual field right now, and it's a field of light. It's obviously light everywhere, light, and there's not actually discrete things. There's not. It's not divisible, even though it shows up as being seemingly divisible.
The other thing is that, you know, even if you think there's a boundary,
Mm-hmm.
boundary is always shifting.
Right.
So even if you could find the boundary, you immediately lose it because it becomes another boundary.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, it's slippery, it's so slippery. It just slips right through our fingers. We try to grasp hold of it. And that's what some of the spiritual traditions describe it as, the ungraspable. It doesn't have a handle, but we're trying to get a handle on it. It's all of our descriptions and all of our explanations and all of the map making that we do to try to explain phenomena, to try to explain like what's going on in the world, say right now. Good luck with that. But just watch, what, as reflecting a lot on this morning about oversimplifying, and I thought about, maybe I don't, when I'm writing and sharing about this stuff, I don't tend to venture off into politics really, but I thought about possibly writing something, drawing a link between the way language and conceptualization works to seemingly describe the parts, as you were saying, is through oversimplifying. Basically, you take something that is infinitely complex and we try to describe it. And the only way we can pull that off is to oversimplify it. And consciousness does it. It's not something that we are doing per se. And life does this oversimplifying. And a lot of social discourse, as I listen to it, is just gross oversimplifications of what's actually going on, as a way of putting people and events into categories. And it's like, doesn't really hold up under scrutiny. It's so much more complex than our oversimplified explanations make it out to be. You take any description of a person, this person is this way. It's a complete oversimplification. That's not the way they are. They're an infinite number of ways. It's like it's the oversimplifying can be useful, right? It's a useful way to, words and language are useful, but there are oversimplifications. It's like describing someone in terms of their political persuasion or their personality characteristics. There are oversimplifications that could be useful ways of conveying something about who and what they are. But it's like, I think I talk about this in the book somewhere, but I use the image of the bell-shaped curve. And, if you're, I also teach research and statistics, and I'll use this to talk about it. But, what is a bell-shaped curve? Well, if you look at if I were to describe, like, add your personality, it would be those characteristics that are the most predominant in the bell-shaped curve. In other words, that's the most of what you have, whether it's, tendency towards being extroverted or being intellectual or kind-hearted, kind of your dominant quote unquote characteristics. There's what's showing up in the big giant part of the bell-shaped curve, like the middle of it, the median of it. But then you go out to the edges of it, right? And it's like, well, those are the characteristics that you also have, but maybe you don't, they're not as prominent, they're not like the prominent flavor of Ed, but they're still there. They're aspects of you. But the thing about the bell-shaped curve is it goes out, like statistically speaking, you're like, now you're 1 and 2 standard deviations like away from the average. And those are the things that don't occur as frequently, right? But the bell-shaped curve goes out into infinity. Like, I never get to the end of who Ed is, or who anything, or what anything is. So when I start acting as if I do know what you are, because I've got a map, I've got my characterization of you fall into this personality type, or this Enneagram type, or this astrological type. It's useful, but it's ultimately bullshit, because I can't type you, because you're infinite. So what type do you belong in? Well, you belong in the infinity type. That's the type you are. Because I can never get to the end of what you are. I'll never, ever get to the end. I take any aspect of you, of who you are, the way you think, the way you perceive, the way you experience life. And each one of those aspects, there's like an infinite number of aspects, and each of those aspects themselves have no bottom to them. I mean, it's just incredible, isn't it? It's just incredible how unfathomable everything is. And it's beautiful somehow, because it cuts through the misleading nature of the oversimplifying. It's so misleading to imagine that we have it figured out. It's just not true. It's just not true. It's like the ultimate hubris. Oh yeah, I know the explanation for this. No, you don't. You don't, because it's beyond explanation. It's too infinite. It's too ungraspable. And but we like to have narratives to be able to explain this, apparently, because we certainly do a lot of that as humans, don't we?
Now, I'm a scientist by training,
Oh, you are? I didn't know that.
and we like to hold on to science as the holder of truth,
Mhm.
and especially physics, right?
Sure.
The
The hardest of the hard sciences, right? Yeah.
one thing non-scientists don't realize, that we have these equations, right, that define certain aspects of reality,
Hmm.
but in most cases we can't solve those equations. So you hear Einstein's relativity, right?
Hmm.
The actual solutions for any real problem can't be solved, and so they use approximations and techniques that are not built into the equations. These are additional things that kind of work.
Right.
So we have this idea that we have this law that we can apply to, that is applied to everything, but that's not the way science actually works. And so even the exactness of science
Hmm.
is a myth, is is something that we hold on to simplify
Right.
this.
Right. It's kind of like, I think we tend to take the attitude like, well, it's close enough, and because it works in a sense. It's like I had a thing in the last book about the impossibility of measurement. There's a chapter in there, and I talk about like weighing somebody and how much do you do weigh? And I say, well, you get on a scale and it tells me, it's that you weigh 180 pounds or whatever. Okay. So, and I say, okay, well, maybe I could get a more sensitive scale that would be more accurate. And if I put you on the more sensitive scale and it tells me, no, actually, you're not 180 pounds, you're 179.9 pounds, that's actually how much you weigh. But what if I got an even more sensitive scale and I play this out all the way? And it's like, well, there's no end to that, is there? Like I could always get closer to the exact amount that you weigh, but I'll never ever arrive there because it could always be one more numeral of exactness. And it's just like, but I don't really need to know that you weigh 179.897654. I don't need to know that. It's good enough that you weigh 179.9 or 180. That's close enough, But that's it. We can't get to the bottom of what anything is. It's just a metaphor. Who cares about weight in that sense? It's not that relevant. But when it comes to this assumption that we have that we're able to encapsulate this with our concepts, with our measurements, with our maps, it's just not true. And the discovery that that's not true has a whole different set of, you could say, kind of experiential human implications to it, because we're freed of the apparent limiting nature of the maps and the explanations and the descriptions that suggest, they basically suggest that limits, where through investigation we can discover that there aren't limits. Limits can't be found, which is astonishing. You can't actually find limitations experientially.
Well, the thing that came to mind is we're not one weight. Our weight is constantly changing. Every time we breathe in, we get more weight.
Well,
Every
that
time
really
we
throws
breathe out.
that really throws a monkey into the, like, say I'm a psychologist, and psychologists are interested in trying to measure human experience. If you're trying to do quantitative research on humans, right? So I want to know, are you experiencing anxiety? So I come up with a measure to try to capture that. Well, first of all, imagine how impossible that is. And yet it can still be useful to get some sense of, is the drug that I'm developing to try to help lessen people's anxiety having a beneficial effect? Well, it can be helpful to try to get a sense of that from a measurement standpoint. But the game of trying to encapsulate human experience in a measure is impossible, even if it was something that was static. But then when you consider the possibility that it's changing, like, okay, well, I measured it in that instant, but then in the next instant it was different. So I mean, it's so crude. It's when I'm teaching research to my students, I'll just start laughing. I'm going like, it's so crude what we're trying to do. It's barely scratching the surface of what the human is actually experiencing. Just appreciate that. And um, but appreciate that when it comes to what we do with language and conceptualization about our experience, because it leads us to believe that we know what this is. And just look, and it will reveal that this is not fathomable. It doesn't collapse down into a description, actually.
One of the things that drives the seeking is the idea that we know something.
Right.
We just need to know more.
Right.
Once you realize you know nothing, that's one way of the seeking dropping.
Absolutely.
Oh, John.
Hey, Michael.
Oh,
Nice to hear you.
Nice to hear you. I joined late. I overslept. I showed up at 10:30. Are you going the full hour and a half this week, or are you,
I think so.
all right? Very good. So, um, I happened to see a YouTube video with Ken Wilber.
Hmm.
I think he was being interviewed by someone, and he said there seems to be a difference between waking up and growing up. And,
Hmm.
and some people, evidently, who have experienced spiritual awakening uh, may not be fully mature in the ordinary human sense. Uh, I guess the question would be, it, how, I think this comes from Ramdas, that you have to be somebody before you can be nobody. How the role of ordinary maturation and working out, say, course psychological
Hmm.
obstacles. How, in your direct engagement with the psychological realm
Hmm.
as a psychologist
Hmm.
and having worked with many people, in real world terms, how how necessary is it to sort of refine all of that, or process that out, heal it, whatever, before the radical uh, uh, the nature of
Hmm.
reality in the most radical sense can be approached.
Mm. Um, I don't know. I'm always hesitant to say it is one way or the other. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I because it well that the problem with that is that it overlooks individual differences, which is why I wouldn't want to say it's one way or the other. Depends on the person, always. Um, and I mean, one simple way I would describe this is that um, if you're trying to explore something, um, it'd be like, well, I'm just thinking like, you want to go and explore the nature of the underwater world, so you're going to go um, on a
Scuba,
on a scuba
scuba.
diving trip,
Yeah.
excursion, and you're going to investigate all these remarkable creatures underneath the water, and so, but you've got this horrifically painful thing going on with your body. I don't know, something with your neck, which is just so distracting, in the sense of it's pulling your attention so strongly,
Mm-hmm.
um, that makes it difficult to enjoy the exploration, to discover all that's there to be explored underneath the sea, because again, your attention's just pulled to this thing. So it's maybe not a great metaphor, but it's like, if say with the kind of inquiry that I'm inviting people into through my work here and my writings and stuff, if people find that their attention is really being pulled very strongly away from that exploration and into, oh feelings of tremendous self-doubt, or tremendous, what they might feel as sort of unresolved things in their life. Maybe they can't get a job, and so they're suffering economically, and their health isn't well. These kinds of things that could be, um, sort of like Maslow, the famous psychologist, had his hierarchy of needs.
Right. I remember
and
that. Yeah.
and he had his like survival needs, and needs for security, and so on, and needs for belonging, and that when these things are fundamentally not met, it can be, you're starving to death, and you might not be hopping on a Zoom call like this to investigate the nature of reality, because that's pulling your attention, like it's a very immediate need, right? So from that standpoint, you could say that some amount of attention to areas of one's life that feel way out of balance, or or are pulling one, you know what I mean, are kind of dominating consciousness to such a degree that they just find that it makes it difficult to investigate what's here in the kinds of ways that I'm inviting. So that would be one thing that I would say, that in that case, well, you know, maybe you need to take care of those things at the level of those things, let's say, right? Like, it's sort of like you could have an absolute like horrific migraine headache, that could be explored and discovered to be the very fundamental ground of reality itself, what you're calling a headache, just like every other phenomena. But you might feel so pulled, just like as an organism, it might be so difficult to do that because of the excruciating nature of the headache, that you might just need to deal with that headache at the level of the headache as best you can, through taking medications or drinking more water or whatever you do to take care of your migraine, you know. So that's just to say, you know, could I come back to your question about kind of say psychological things, that I will, and I tell my grad students who are studying to be therapists this, that that I'm just providing another way of exploring. They're learning all these cognitive behavioral therapy and psychodynamic therapy and mindfulness and all this other approaches to dealing with one's psyche, that are all can be incredibly useful. And then I'm introducing this other perspective, which is basically kind of deconstructing all of the psychological experience, kind of getting at the root of what it all is fundamentally. And like I said, I wrote a meme recently that problems can be addressed at two levels. They can be addressed at the level of the problem itself, which is based on what we're describing, and then we can take steps to address that thing we're describing, whether it's physical pain or emotional pain or whatever, or life circumstances. Or, and this is what I'm, you know, emphasizing here in these calls, is we can investigate, we can discover that what we imagine to be problems aren't actually problems, owing to their unresolvable nature, or their indefinable nature. And both of those can work alongside each other, you know. They're not, it's not an either or from my perspective. I
Elaborate
think,
on that, because it
yeah,
would seem to be contradict. It would seem
sure,
that it could be contradictory.
it could be, but again, I like to say we live, as it were, in two worlds that aren't really two worlds, but show up as, you know, the described world and the ultimately indescribable world. So, you know, it's like if I have an absolutely splitting headache, I could investigate what pain is and discover pain is unfindable, and because it's infinite and bottomless. And that can be its own kind of medicine, you know, because I touch something about the pain that's free of pain, literally. It's not bound in that description. But I might also address it at the level of the description and take an aspirin. Why not? It's not, to me, they're not contradictory, even though they can certainly seem to be. Yeah. I think
It's also indescribable.
What's that?
Which is also indescribable.
Right. I mean, exactly. It's like, you know, even talking about it as two possibly conflicting things is like that, you know, it's, I mean, one of the things I love about the transcendental is that it's inclusive of everything, right? So it doesn't, like, recognizing that there's no time can't be found as an actuality in experience doesn't mean that it negates the experience of time. It just shows another facet of it, which is that time is ultimately unfindable, right? Or discovering that the body isn't a body. In other words, it's transcendental consciousness or transcendental energy, or who knows what it is, doesn't negate the experience of the form of the body, right? So that sounds incredibly contradictory. Look, either there's a body or there's not a body, you know. And I would say no. It's like it doesn't collapse into that. They're not. It's not really contradictory. I mean, it's our actual experience. It's like a simultaneity of of emptiness and form. The forms are the
Uh,
descriptions, the definable, seemingly, the forms that seem to have independent existence, right? But we can explore those forms and we can discover that they can't be found as having independent existence, right? Because they're empty. And yet the discovery of emptiness doesn't negate the forms. So
hmm.
so one can do therapy to address their anxiety, and they can simultaneously investigate what they call anxiety and discover that it can't be found. And I think there are times when that more transcendental kind of inquiry can become its own. In other words, it can solve the problem even at the level of the problem. Not always.
Hmm.
You know what I
Hmm.
mean? It's like, I have certainly found this, that like so-called afflictive states of mind, I don't have a tendency to try to fix them or make them go away. Instead, I just explore their nature. And then I find in that exploration that I now have this greater capacity to simply be with the forms, without feeling that I'm somehow the victim of them, that they're
Hmm.
somehow going to harm me. So it's like, I've told this story a few times of going through a intense period of grief, and it was like, I remember people in my life going, this is too much. It's like, this is overwhelming. Like, are you okay? And I'd be like, yeah, I'm fine, even though it felt like I was falling apart. It just wasn't a problem, even though it was excruciatingly painful at one level too. It's very hard to explain that, but it's like, that is my experience, though, that discovering the transcendental nature of all these phenomenal experiences, including our afflictive states, can open up, um, this whole other, we like access this whole other dimension of those experiences that reveals their non-problematic nature. And sometimes that is enough that we don't actually have to take any remedial steps to somehow rectify them. Not always. We might still go to therapy to try to figure out, why am I still grieving this loss? I mean, that could be, just from a pure preference standpoint, right? Like, I would prefer to not have this headache, even if I know it's transcendental consciousness. I still don't want to have a headache because I don't, right? So that's kind of one way I would sort of look at it. But I don't know if that's helpful at all. But
Well, again, the Ken Wilber
mhm.
interview, I think it was in regard to some people who claim to be
Right.
have had spiritual
Hmm.
realization, and yet who's still manifest seemingly
Right.
aberrant or discordant conduct.
Right. And he would see that,
Uh,
he would say those people have successfully woken up but not grown up somehow.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Uh, sure. I mean, and he's one I know, because I know Ken's work quite well, that he suggests that waking up to the unfathomable nature of this, the non-problematic nature of all of this, the transcendental nature of it, doesn't necessarily result in somebody being integrated integrated
Mm.
psychologically, and so on, right? And that may be very true. Um, I think that, um, I don't think it's I think that there's a lot about waking up that can be very maturing, though, and can be very, in a human sense. I think that it can transform the way we relate to other people in very beneficial ways. It can transform the way we relate to our own experience in beneficial ways. So I think it is also inherently, or oftentimes seems to be, um, make for wiser, more compassionate human beings. Um,
Hmm.
but in some cases, maybe where people have had a lot of whatever, difficult times earlier in their life, let's say, experience a lot of whatever, trauma. It's an overused word these days, but um, there's stuff in there somehow that um, kind of at the level of their personalities, the way they show up with other people, that somehow isn't that touched by whatever it is they've realized, spiritually speaking. Um, as to whether or not those particular individuals have an impetus to change the way they're being in the world, well, who knows? Well, that's a very individual thing. Some may, some may not.
Yeah, that's exactly what Jack Cornfield
Mm-hmm.
has observed. He said uh, sometimes people of spiritual practice will not touch whole areas
Mm-hmm.
that are very deeply held in one's
Mm-hmm.
being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and again, so one might find along the way, like they may have had very profound realizations into the nature of reality, and they're still struggling somehow in their relationships, let's say, to maybe they feel they struggle in how they communicate with other people, and maybe they then, if they're inclined to alter that, to have more harmonized ways of relating to other people, if they're inclined that way, then they might seek out, they might find it beneficial to get some support in that area, from, in some way, whether through therapy or whatever, just um but I think that whole um yeah, I think that I think it is the case that one can have very profound realizations and still seemingly, uh, be acting in ways that are, you know, um, seem less than wholly wise.
John, just one more little quick
Yeah, yeah.
question in this regard. So, do you? As I honestly don't know, but in your um, educated opinion, or just your sense,
Mm-hmm.
do you think that there is such a thing as crazy wisdom, where these people, allegedly very deeply awake, can conduct themselves in ways that are hard to fathom from that point of view, that don't seem to
Mm-hmm.
be in accordance with wakefulness? I'm not going to name any names, but probably
Mm-hmm.
most people present this morning are familiar, have heard
Mm-hmm.
about teachers that have acted very eccentrically, and sometimes it's said,
Mm-hmm.
their tradition, or the people who are in their sort of world, that this is not what it appears to be. This is the manifestation of
Yeah.
crazy wisdom. They are so free, they're not even bound by what would be considered.
Social norms or anything. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I can imagine that. Um, it could just be the way maybe I'm inclined. I don't really know, but I feel like there seems to be a kind of natural instinct. Um, uh, I don't know how to put this into words, but um, I have encountered some people who were acting in ways as teachers that were, just flat out pretty abusive, and and I I don't know. I didn't know exactly how to explain that, but it did make me wonder what exactly had they realized.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Let's put it that way.
mm-hmm. You're keeping it
Because
open.
they may be, you know, they may have seen something and realized something and had a gift and an ability to convey what it was that they had seen and realized and help awaken that in
Mm.
other people.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, I think I honestly, I would say in the end, what I'm talking about has nothing to do with
Yeah.
teachers or teachings.
Uh-huh.
And it has everything to do with exploring your experience and discovering its nature.
Yeah, that's
And
the
and
only,
what
yeah.
whatever the teacher has or has not realized, at one level, I would say, who gives a shit? You know, it's like, how can we even really ultimately ascertain that anyway? I mean, how can you know, for example, what my experience is? Well, you can't. We cannot know one another's experience. How can you, you know, maybe that plays some role in the degree to which you feel some measure of trust and
Trust,
confidence in
yeah,
the fact that
yeah.
you're even, say, in this case, you know, on this Zoom call listening to me, whatever I'm spouting. But ultimately, where all the juice is the only thing that exists, which is your experience. Because even, like, say in the case of me, I'm in this particular role, right, facilitating the call, but each of you only knows me as experience. So you don't know me. I don't exist other than as your experience. So that's where it all is. That's all that exists is your experience. And you never, that you missed the very beginning of the call, but this is what I was talking about, was you can't ever get outside of experience. And so this is where all the action is. This is where all the juice is. This is where the absolute reality lies. It doesn't lie in a teacher and whatever he or she may have not realized and how grown up and mature they are psychologically. Who cares? I mean, we could be interested in that. It's something that I have been interested in at different times. But what I'm interested in saying to people is, don't worry about the teacher. Just investigate what's here in your experience, and that's where everything that you're looking for can be found, right
Mm-hmm.
there, right in your
Mm-hmm.
experience. And it's so much more empowering than getting too caught up and worried about who the teacher is and what they've realized or not realized, or how integrated their realization is in a human way. I mean, it's like, no, I wouldn't get too concerned about that.
No, no,
Stuff.
I'm not. I'm not. I'm
Yeah.
not. Uh, that, I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm overly concerned with it. It's just that, especially now having access to YouTube, the issues in these different
Mm-hmm.
communities with different teachers, it's almost. I mean, I used to see it as more. Uh, it was rare. It was unusual. Now it almost seems to be. I mean, it's all too common. There's
Mm-hmm.
so many, just about in every tradition, in both the formal lineages and the teachers outside of lineages. So yeah, try. My mind just wants to understand, things as much as possible. And how can this be?
Mm-hmm.
And someone has seen through
Yes.
the uh, the illusion of ultimate
Yeah.
uh, uh, separation, and yet it's still the person seemingly is still acting as if they were, you know, you know, a isolated entity.
No, it's a legitimate question. I get it. I understand the question. Um, we could say that some of that is, that one can. Most of us have seen this to one degree or another in our own lives. That you can have an insight into this perspective of the inseparable perspective, and then just out of habit, return to old familiar ways of seeing and reacting to life, right? And believing in all the things that you're describing and defining as having a kind of substantive existence. That can happen despite having seen very profoundly this other perspective. So maybe that's one way to explain it.
Mm-hmm,
That
mm-hmm,
it's just a
mm-hmm,
falling back into habitual patterns,
mm-hmm.
maybe without even realizing it.
Another way of saying that is another boundary between awakening going back to sleep.
Right.
You can't really find that boundary either.
You can't ultimately find it. No. No, it can show up, seemingly, and we could describe it as, um, in those kinds of terms, um, but yeah, that boundary is not findable like all other boundaries. Yeah, like that becomes a very fascinating exploration. Like what we call the failure to see this is yet another experience that's ultimately indescribable. So, like I said at the outset, the illumination is constant. There's just the illumination.
Hmm.
It's relentlessly the case.
So, John, there's that nature.
Mm-hmm.
Just for the sake of discussion,
Mm-hmm.
call it radiance or
Mm-hmm.
beingness, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's, or put in a different way, there's the nature of mind,
Mm-hmm.
and then conditioned mind. And more and more, there's a sense now in my experience of, the one has nothing to do with what I would think of as my world. Well, it, it does and it doesn't. It's the context of
Mm-hmm.
quote my world, but it's not limited.
Mm-hmm.
It's transpersonal, as they say.
Right.
So the that's where the freedom. I mean, that as the gentleman, I don't know his name, earlier
Mm-hmm.
mentioned. Einstein said that a problem can never be solved at its own level. So conditioned mind can never pull itself up by its own bootstraps. It takes the introduction and experience or revelation of
Mm-hmm.
the nature of the ultimate nature, whatever you want to call it.
Well, what I try to point out is I try to de-emphasize those dichotomies, and one way I would do that is to look at whatever we're calling, like identification and getting beyond identification, or conditioned mind, and what we're describing as conditioned mind. Look and see what that is, and you can discover that what you're calling, what one calls a so-called conditioned mind or the interpreting mind, is itself also the revelation, that there's only the revelation. And that one of the effects of that is that um, it it changes the human experience to realize that, it's like to see that the real liberation is to see that there's no such thing as bondage, that bondage is a description of what bondage is, yet another attempt to put into a framework something that can't be put into a framework. And it may be experienced for the human as what we might call constriction or bondage or limitation. But again, all of those words are attempts to describe something that's fundamentally indescribable. So what is the mind even? I mean, where is the mind? What is mind? I mean, again, we're partializing the whole and attempting to define something that can't be found. And that can be discovered. We can discover that mind cannot be found. Not as something that can be pinned down and clearly defined.
Well, I meant primarily in the sense of the mental afflictions, the kleshas, so that in one which arises and causes a sense of, let's say,
Right.
disturbance or inability to be at peace.
Right.
It's that same thing.
Right. But I could say the exact same thing I just said, which is that, and I'm just going to finish with this because I have to jump off this call in a moment. But we can find freedom from the so-called afflictive states, not by going, I mean, sometimes one way is to discover that they're happening within a vast context that's not defined by those states. That is one method. But another method is to explore the afflictive states themselves and discover what they're made of. And that cuts to the root and can reveal that the afflictive states are the shine of the basic state. They are the display of God, that they're made of the fundamental reality. And oftentimes the effort to try to get beyond the afflictive states or to transcend them or can continue to perpetuate the view that they have an independent existence, that they represent, that they, in other words, it's very subtle. You know this, I'm sure, that the effort to get beyond being a separate self can perpetuate the sense of being a separate self. The effort to get beyond identification is to reify identification as being something that must be overcome. So it's tricky,
Well, the effort, I think in say any given moment, and one feels, okay, I must move beyond this. It's painful. I must discover the nature of mind, whatever.
I mean, that's a natural impulse. Yeah.
It was a natural impulse. It's the impulse of let's say, of aversion or everything from irritation to full-blown anger and hatred.
Yeah.
But there's basically, as you and I would assume everybody in the meeting knows, there's basically just three forms of three root of forms of confusion, and that's grasping, aversion, and then ignorance. So if you look at it in those terms, the stronger the sense of inherent okayness is, the less bite those afflictive states have. That's how it seems in my experience.
Right, and yeah, I mean, the tricky thing is to well, we can easily reinforce the seemingly problematic nature of those states by continuing to try to resolve them. And because it perpetuates, in other words, it's the very illusion of their definable, resolvable nature that's why cutting to the root is to see what they're. I remember you talking in something I was listening to the other day of you talking with Peter about this, that some teacher who told you, like, just go to what they are, find out what they're made of, because that cuts to the root.
Yeah, and that I mean, I think it probably not it's a reasonable conclusion that people in different phases of the journey, sometimes, like the Papaji recommendation to drop the search, that might be the natural expression of, let's say, one's on the stage of the journey where one is at a particular time, but also it's the very pain of the conditioned mind that drives one to do whatever. So I think that's I think to say at a certain stage, just don't do anything, drop the search. The very seeking is the problem. I doesn't jive with my own sense
Yeah,
of
and
how it.
just to say, I definitely did not, in the case of what I was just saying to you, I wasn't saying that. I was suggesting one approach, which is to look at and feel into the very nature of what is arising that's being described as an affliction and explore its nature. That's different than whatever, just give up the search. I mean, that's not what I said. I
No,
said
no, and
actually
I did. Yeah,
investigate what's here and discover that this is not what we think it is. And the discovery of that is liberation. It's liberation from all the descriptions and all the definitions, period.
yeah. It's just, and I did not mean to say that you're
Hmm.
advocating
Yeah,
simply
yeah,
dropping the search. I'm just saying
right.
that because eventually the search will drop what I guess Papaji meant by that,
Hmm.
the mind that is seeking outside of, let's say, you know, grasping,
Right.
trying to grasp at something, that will dissolve naturally in the as the nature, the basic nature is revealed.
Absolutely.
One would not
Absolutely.
even have to
Yeah.
try to do that. But that I just, it was a little minor side point.
Yeah.
Simply tell people don't do anything that that
Hmm.
I think there is a phase where
Hmm.
effort or searching or inquiring.
Hmm.
I think that is just inevitable. It's like
Sure.
you have to pick up the stick and stir the fire before you can throw the stick into the fire.
I think oftentimes it's like you said, the the searching for something else comes to its own natural resolve by recognizing
Right. That's right.
um,
That's right.
that
That's right.
recognizing the indivisible nature of this.
That's
Absolutely.
right.
Yeah. Listen, I'm going to have to sign off here, folks. Lovely to be with all of you. Thank you for being here, and I wish you all a wonderful rest of your Sundays. And
So thank you,
see
John.
you.
How is your father doing?
He's
I
doing better. He's miraculously on the mend. So thank you for asking.
Wow,
Appreciate it. Yeah,
that's wonderful.
it's pretty amazing.
Great,
He has a lot of
great.
resilience. So
Very good to hear
yeah,
that.
thank you. Thank you. Be well, everyone, and take good care of yourselves, and see you another time, hopefully. All right.
Thank you, John. Thank you
Mhm.
so much. It was beautiful.
Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.